Frank Miller knew his wife was special from the day they met. Susan wasn't like other women. She stood straight, walked with purpose, and had eyes that missed nothing. After 15 years of marriage, he still found himself amazed by her. What most people in their quiet neighborhood of Cedar Creek didn't know is that Susan Miller had spent 12 years in Special Forces before retiring. She had fought in 3 different war zones, could speak 4 languages, and knew how to use almost every weapon made by humans. These days, she taught self-defense classes at the local community center and kept her past life private. Frank worked as an engineer at the local factory. He was good with machines and computers, but not much of a fighter. Susan often joked that between them they could either build something or break it. It was a simple life, and they were happy. On a cool Tuesday night in April, Frank woke up to an empty bed. The clock showed 2:17 a.m. Strange blue light filtered through the curtains, painting weird shapes on the bedroom wall. "Susan?" Frank called out, his voice thick with sleep. No answer came. The house felt too quiet. Frank got out of bed and checked the bathroom. Empty. He walked downstairs, flipping on lights as he went. The kitchen was clean and untouched. The living room sat dark and still. The front door was locked from the inside, just as they had left it before bed. Back upstairs, Frank noticed the bedroom window was open, the curtains moving gently in the night breeze. Susan never left windows open at night. It was one of her security rules. A low humming sound filled the air outside, fading slowly like a car driving away. But it didn't sound like any car Frank had ever heard. It sounded wrong. Frank rushed to the window and looked outside. In the dark sky above, something large moved away from his house. It wasn't a plane or helicopter. It had no blinking lights, just a solid blue glow that seemed to pulse. As he watched, the object shot straight up at impossible speed and vanished. Susan was gone. The blue light was gone. The humming sound was gone. Frank grabbed his phone and dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "1, what's your emergency?" a calm voice answered. "My wife is missing," Frank said. I think someone took her." The police arrived 20 minutes later. Officer Dan Kelly and his partner Lisa Gomez walked through the house, taking notes and asking questions. "No signs of forced entry," Officer Kelly said, shining his flashlight around the bedroom window. "No footprints in the flower bed below." "Could she have left on her own?" Officer Gomez asked. "Maybe she couldn't sleep and went for a walk." Frank shook his head hard. "You don't know Susan. She would never just leave in the middle of the night without telling me, and she definitely wouldn't leave the window open." "What about the blue lights you mentioned?" Officer Kelly asked, his tone making it clear he didn't quite believe Frank. "I saw them. And there was this humming sound like electric power lines, but deeper." The officers exchanged a look that Frank recognized all too well. They thought he was confused or lying. "We'll file a missing persons report," Officer Gomez said kindly. "But without signs of struggle or forced entry, there's not much more we can do tonight." After the police left, Frank sat on the edge of the bed staring at Susan's empty pillow. He jumped when someone knocked on his front door. It was Gerald Watson, their next-door neighbor. Gerald was in his 70s, a retired science teacher who often stayed up late watching the stars through his telescope. "Frank, I saw the police cars," Gerald said. "Is everything okay?" Frank told him about Susan's disappearance and the strange blue light. Gerald's eyes widened. "I saw it too. I was up with my telescope when this craft appeared over your house. It wasn't like anything I've ever seen before. It hovered for about 3 minutes, then shot straight up faster than any aircraft could possibly move." "Did you tell the police?" Frank asked. Gerald nodded. "I called right after you did. They didn't seem to take me seriously either. Probably think I'm just a crazy old man." For the first time since waking up alone, Frank felt a spark of hope. Someone else had seen it. He wasn't going crazy. "Come inside," Frank said. "We need to figure this out." In Frank's kitchen, the 2 men talked until sunrise. Gerald had taken pictures through his telescope, but the images were blurry. Just a blue smudge against the night sky. Still, it was proof of something. "I've been watching the skies for 40 years, Gerald said. Never seen anything move like that. Whatever it wasn't made by humans." Frank ran his hands through his hair. "Are you saying aliens took my wife?" Gerald looked uncomfortable but didn't back down. "I'm saying we should consider all possibilities." Frank's computer dinged with an incoming email. He opened it to find a blank message with an attachment. The sender address was just random numbers and letters. "That's weird," Frank muttered, clicking on the attachment. The image that opened made both men gasp. It showed what looked like the inside of a metal room with strange curved walls. In the corner of the image was Susan. She was strapped to some kind of table, but her eyes were open and alert. She wasn't looking at the camera. Instead, she was studying something off to the side, her expression focused and calculating. "That's her," Frank whispered. "That's my Susan." Gerald adjusted his glasses, staring at the screen. "Look at her face, Frank. She's not panicking." Frank nodded slowly. "No, she's not. She's thinking." Anyone who didn't know Susan might have missed it, but Frank recognized that look. It was the same expression she wore when facing any problem. Calm, focused, assessing. It was the face of a woman who had been trained to handle the worst situations imaginable. A second email arrived. This one contained what looked like coordinates and strange symbols nobody could read. "She's sending us information," Frank realized. Somehow she's found a way to communicate. Gerald studied the symbols. "I have a friend at the university who studies languages. Maybe she can help." Frank kept staring at the picture of his wife. Most people would be terrified if taken by strange beings to a strange place. But Susan wasn't most people. And whoever, or whatever, had taken her was about to learn a very important lesson. They had kidnapped the wrong wife. Now they had a serious problem. Susan Miller woke up in a room unlike any she had ever seen. The walls curved in strange ways and the light came from everywhere and nowhere at once. She was strapped to a flat surface that wasn't quite a table and wasn't quite a bed. The straps were made of something that looked like metal but felt like rubber. 15 years of Special Forces training had taught Susan one important lesson. When captured, first assess the situation before taking action. She kept her eyes half closed and her breathing slow and steady, pretending to be unconscious while she studied her surroundings. The room hummed with quiet energy. Strange symbols glowed on the walls. 3 tall figures moved around the space, their bodies too thin and their heads too large to be human. They had skin that shimmered slightly like fish scales catching light. Their eyes were huge and black, with no whites visible. Susan had been in many dangerous situations before, but this was beyond anything she had trained for. Still, the basic rules remained the same. Observe, gather information, find weaknesses, make a plan. The tallest of the 3 beings approached her and held up a small device. It made a soft chirping sound as it passed over her body. "Specimen is conscious," the being said in a voice that sounded like several people talking at once. Pretending to be in sleep state, Susan opened her eyes fully. "No point in pretending anymore. Where am I?" she asked, keeping her voice calm and level. "Who are you?" The 3 beings looked at each other. The tallest one touched something on the wall, and a small object floated down from the ceiling, hovering near Susan's face. It glowed softly as the being spoke again. "We are researchers from the Vexarin Scientific Council," the being said, the high floating device translating its strange sounds into English. "This is a research vessel. You have been selected as a representative specimen of your species for study." Susan processed this information quickly. "Aliens, a research ship." She was a test subject. "My name is Susan Miller," she said clearly. "I am a citizen of Earth. Taking me without permission is kidnapping under our laws." The beings made sounds that might have been laughter. "Earth laws do not apply to the Vexarin," said the medium-sized being. "Your planet has no standing in the Galactic Assembly. Your species is classified as pre-spaceflight primitive." Susan tested the straps holding her down. They were strong, but had some give to them. She could work with that. "What kind of tests "Are you planning?" she asked, trying to sound afraid. It wasn't hard, she was afraid, but fear was a tool, not a master. That's what her first commander had taught her. "Non-invasive biological scans," said the smallest being, who seemed to be wearing something like a white coat. "Psychological response tests. Cognitive function analysis. Your species is of interest because you have developed nuclear technology without developing space travel capacity." "How long will these tests take?" Susan asked. "Earth time measurement is difficult to convert," the tall one said. "Approximately 1 orbital cycle of your planet. A year. They plan to keep her for a year." Susan nodded as if accepting this, while her mind raced through possibilities. The aliens seemed confident, almost careless. They didn't see her as a threat. That was their first mistake. "I need to use the bathroom," Susan said, using the most basic human need as an excuse. The beings consulted with each other in their strange language before the medium one approached. "Waste elimination can be processed through the examination table," it said. "No movement is necessary." Susan switched tactics. "I'm feeling sick, I might throw up." The tallest alien seemed concerned at this. "Specimen contamination would compromise data. Temporary release may be necessary." The strap across Susan's chest loosened, then the one over her hips. As the beings prepared to release her legs, Susan watched carefully how they operated the restraints. Each strap had a small panel where the aliens pressed their long fingers in a specific pattern. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Frank worked with Gerald to understand the strange messages coming to his computer. Every few hours, new information arrived. Strange. Symbols, blurry images, and strings of numbers. Gerald had contacted his friend at the university, Dr. Olivia Bryant, who taught linguistics and mathematics. She arrived at Frank's house carrying several thick books and a laptop. "These aren't random," Dr. Bryant said, pointing to the symbols. "There's a pattern here. And these number sequences, they're coordinates, but not for any mapping system I recognize." "Susan is trying to tell us something," Frank said. "She wouldn't send useless information." Gerald's phone rang. It was his nephew, Ben Hall, who worked at the local radio station as a technician. "Uncle Gerald, you need to come down here," Ben said, his voice excited. "Those strange signals you asked me to look for, they're coming through strong now, and they're definitely not from any source on Earth." Gerald looked at Frank. "We need to go to the radio station. Ben may have found something." At the station, Ben showed them the signal patterns on his equipment. "It's like nothing I've ever seen before. The signal is coming from somewhere above Earth, but it's not from any satellite we have registered." "Can you track where exactly it's coming from?" Frank asked. Ben nodded. "I've been triangulating the position using some friends at other stations. Whatever is sending this is moving, but it's staying in orbit around Earth." Dr. Bryant studied the signal patterns. "These match the symbols in the messages you've been receiving, Frank. I think Susan has found a way to access their communication system." Back on the alien ship, Susan had been temporarily released from the table and allowed to move around a small area of the room under close watch. She memorized everything she saw, the control panels, the door mechanisms, the way the aliens communicated with the ship's systems. When they weren't looking directly at her, she tested the strength of various objects, checked airflow patterns, and mapped out the room's layout. Years of training had made this second nature to her. Later, when they secured her back to the table, Susan began working on the next phase of her plan. She had noticed a pattern in how the ship's systems operated. Everything was controlled by touch patterns and voice commands. The aliens didn't use passwords or keys. They relied on the fact that humans wouldn't understand their technology. But Susan Miller wasn't a typical human. She had been trained to adapt to unfamiliar weapons and equipment in the field, and she had a perfect memory for patterns and sequences. That night, while the aliens thought she was sleeping, Susan worked her fingers against the restraint panel, slowly replicating the release pattern she had observed. It took hours of careful, tiny movements, but eventually, she felt the satisfying click of the lock disengaging. She didn't free herself yet, not until she had a full plan. Instead, she continued gathering information and sending coded messages to Earth. using the communication system she had figured out how to access when they let her move around the room. Susan Miller was no longer just a specimen. She was a soldier behind enemy lines, and she was preparing to fight back. 3 days had passed since Susan Miller was taken. On the alien ship, she had been carefully building her knowledge and preparing for action. The aliens, who called themselves Vexerans, had fallen into a routine. They ran tests during what seemed to be their day cycle and left her with minimal watching during their night cycle. Susan had mapped out the entire lab section of the ship. When they moved her between rooms for different tests, she counted steps, noted doorways, and memorized the control panel locations. The Vexerans thought she was scared and confused. They didn't notice her studying everything around her. Tonight was the night to make her first move. Susan waited until the lab was empty except for one Vexeran, the smallest one who seemed to be some kind of medical officer. She had nicknamed this one Doc in her mind. Doc was focused on a glowing screen, its back to Susan. Susan touched the hidden release points on her restraints in the exact pattern she had seen the Vexerans use. The straps loosened silently. She stayed still, making sure Doc hadn't noticed. When the alien didn't turn around, Susan carefully slipped free from the table. Moving silently across the room, Susan approached Doc from behind. She had learned, from watching, that Vexerans had a sensitive spot at the base of their long necks. One quick press and Doc slumped forward, unconscious but not harmed. Susan worked quickly. She took Doc's communication device and what looked like an access tool. Then she dragged the alien into a storage area and used the restraint straps from the table to tie it up. She found a small container that seemed important to the Vexerans and placed it near Doc as a distraction. Free to move around the lab, Susan went to the main control panel. The symbols were strange, but she had been watching the aliens use it for days. She pressed a series of buttons and a map of the ship appeared on the screen. Susan memorized it, noting key areas: the bridge, engine room, and what looked like escape pods. Using Doc's access tool, Susan left the lab and entered a long, curved hallway. She moved carefully, pressing herself against the wall whenever she heard sounds of approaching Vexerans. Her special forces training had taught her how to move silently even in unfamiliar territory. Susan found what she was looking for, a communication room. Inside, she could send a clearer message to Frank. She sealed the door behind her and went to work on the alien technology. Back on Earth, Frank, Gerald, Dr. Bryant, and Ben had set up a command center in Frank's garage. They had computers, radio, equipment, and charts covering the walls. For 3 days, they had been working to understand Susan's messages and find a way to help her. "Look at this," Ben said, pointing to his screen. "The signal is getting stronger, and it's changing." "Doctor," Bryant leaned over his shoulder, "these aren't random symbols anymore. This looks like technical data." Frank stared at the screen as new information poured in. "It's a ship schematic," he said. "Susan is sending us a map of where she is." "But what can we do with this?" Gerald asked. "It's not like we can go up there and get her." "Maybe we don't have to," Frank said. "Look at this section of data. These look like codes or commands." Dr. Bryant studied the new information. "I think Susan is planning something. She's not just sending us information about where she is. She's sending us information about what she's going to do." On the Vexeran ship, Susan had figured out how to use the communication system. She sent a detailed message to Frank with her plan. Then she accessed the ship's main computer. The Vexerans had been studying humans for years. Their database was full of Earth information, including languages. Susan used this to help understand more of their technology. She discovered something important. The ship was low on fuel. That was why they were orbiting Earth instead of leaving. They were waiting for a supply ship to arrive in 7 days. This gave Susan a timeline to work with. As she worked at the communication station, an alarm suddenly blared through the ship. They had discovered her escape. Susan quickly finished her transmission to Earth, then looked for a way out of the communication room. There was a small maintenance tunnel in the floor. She opened it and slipped inside just as the door to the communication room slid open. Two tall Vexerans rushed in, holding devices that might have been weapons. They looked around the empty room, confused. Susan crawled through the tight tunnel, using the ship map she had memorized to guide her. She needed to find a secure place to hide and plan her next move. Back on Earth, Frank was excited as he read Susan's latest message. "She's free," he told the others. "She's moving around the ship and gathering information, and she says the aliens plan to return to Earth's atmosphere in 7 days when their supply ship arrives." "What does she want us to do?" Ben asked. Frank pointed to a section of the message. "She wants us to be ready. She's going to try to take control of a small craft, something like an escape pod. She'll need us to guide her to a safe landing place when she gets close enough to Earth." Dr. Bryant looked worried. "How is one woman going to take over an alien ship?" Frank smiled slightly. "You don't know Susan. In Afghanistan, she once escaped from a warlord's compound with nothing but a spoon and a shoelace. When she sets her mind to something, it gets done." Gerald was studying the technical data Susan had sent. "This is fascinating. Look at how their propulsion system works. It's nothing like our rockets." "Focus, Gerald," Frank said. "We need to find a place where Susan can land safely when she escapes. Somewhere remote, but somewhere we can reach quickly." Ben pulled up a map on his computer. "There's an old quarry about 30 miles from here. It's not used anymore. Plenty of open space away from towns." "Perfect," Frank said. "Now we need to gather supplies. Susan will need medical help, food, water, and clean clothes when she lands, and we need to be ready to move fast." As they made plans, more data came in from Susan. She was learning about the Vexerans' weaknesses. Their eyes were sensitive to bright flashing lights. Their hearing was easily overloaded by certain sound frequencies. And most importantly, they weren't fighters. They were scientists who had never faced resistance from a test subject before. Susan was no longer sending messages asking for help. She was sending messages telling Frank and the others how they could help her when the time came. She wasn't a victim waiting for rescue. She was a soldier, creating her own escape plan. On the Vexeran ship, Susan had found a small storage area to hide in. She had taken food packets and a water container from the lab. Now she needed to rest and prepare for what came next. The aliens were searching for her, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. They had kidnapped the wrong wife, and they were about to find out just how serious a problem that was. 5 days had passed since Susan Miller was taken from Earth. 3 days since she had escaped from the lab on the Vexeran ship. The aliens were in a state of panic. They had never lost a test subject before, especially not one who was now causing problems all over their ship. Susan moved through the maintenance tunnels that ran between the walls. She had created several hiding spots around the ship where she kept supplies and tools she had taken. The Vexerans weren't fighters. Their security measures were designed to keep subjects in test rooms, not to deal with someone like Susan who knew how to move undetected through enemy territory. From her hiding places, Susan had been causing trouble. She damaged control panels. She rerouted power from important systems. She created false alarms that sent the Vexerans running from one end of the ship to the other. All the while, she was learning more about how the ship worked and sending information back to Earth. The leader of the Vexerans, who Susan had nicknamed Captain, called an emergency meeting. Susan watched through a vent above the meeting room as the aliens gathered. "This is unacceptable," Captain said, pounding a long, thin hand on the table. "One primitive Earth female should not be able to cause this much damage. The specimen is showing skills far beyond our data on humans," said a Vexeran that Susan called Tech because it seemed to be in charge of the ship's systems. "Our research did not indicate that teaching defensive movements to younglings required such knowledge of complex systems." "What is the status of the supply ship?" Captain asked. "It will arrive in 2 Earth days," another Vexeran answered. "But we have a more immediate problem. The specimen has damaged our orbit stabilizers. We are slowly being pulled toward Earth. If we do not make repairs, we will enter the planet's atmosphere in less than 1 Earth day." Susan smiled to herself as she listened. This was exactly what she had planned. The Vexerans wouldn't abandon. Their ship which meant they would have to land. And a landing meant Susan might have a chance to escape. She crawled back through the tunnels to her main hiding spot. There, she used the communication device she had taken to send a new message. To Frank back on Earth, Frank and his team were ready. They had set up equipment at the old quarry, including powerful lights and speakers based on the information Susan had sent about Vexeran weaknesses. Ben had connected with other radio enthusiasts around the country, creating a network that could track the alien ship. "New message coming in," Dr. Bryant announced. She had been monitoring the communication system nonstop. Frank rushed to her side. "What does it say?" "The ship is coming down earlier than planned," Dr. Bryant said, reading the message. "Susan has damaged their orbit systems. They'll have to land within 24 hours. "Is she okay?" Frank asked, worry clear in his voice. "She says she's fine. She's found a small craft aboard the ship that she thinks is an escape pod. She plans to use it during the confusion of the emergency landing." Gerald looked concerned. "Does she know how to fly an alien spacecraft?" Frank shrugged. "She once flew a Russian helicopter after the pilot was shot, and she only had 15 minutes of basic training. If anyone can figure it out, Susan can." Ben checked his equipment. "I'm picking up the ship on radar now. It's definitely losing altitude. At this rate, it should come down near the quarry just like we planned." "Let's pack up and get there now," Frank said. "We need to be ready when Susan arrives." On the Vexeran ship, alarms blared constantly. Red lights flashed through the corridors as the aliens rushed to make repairs. The ship shook as it began to enter Earth's atmosphere. Susan made her way toward Tiu, the small craft she had discovered. It was in a bay near the bottom of the ship, clearly designed for short trips to a planet's surface. She had studied the controls through the window for the past day and believed she could fly it. As she approached the bay, 2 Vexerans appeared in the corridor ahead. They carried devices that looked like weapons. Susan ducked into a side room and looked around for anything she could use. The room held cleaning supplies. She grabbed a container of liquid and a long pole. When the Vexerans passed the door, Susan stepped out behind them and sprayed the liquid at their faces. The aliens screeched and covered their large eyes. Susan swung the pole, hitting the sensitive spot at the base of their necks. Both Vexerans collapsed to the floor. Susan took their weapons and continued to the bay. The door was locked, but she used the access tool she had taken from Doc to open it. Inside, the small craft waited. It looked like a silver teardrop with a clear bubble on top. She climbed inside and studied the controls. There was a panel similar to ones she had seen the Vexorans use on the main ship. Susan pressed what she hoped was the start button. The craft hummed to life, lights coming on across the control panel. The main ship shook harder as it entered the atmosphere. Through the bubble top, Susan could see the bay doors above her. They were still closed. She needed to find a way to open them. On the control panel, Susan found a series of symbols that matched the door controls she had seen elsewhere on the ship. She pressed them in the sequence she had memorized. With a grinding sound, the bay doors began to open. Wind rushed into the bay as the doors slid apart, revealing the blue sky of Earth below. The Vexeran ship was now flying like an airplane, moving forward as it descended. Susan's small craft was not secured to the floor. As the main ship tilted, her craft began to slide toward the open doors. Susan gripped the controls, ready for her chance. She needed to time this perfectly. Too soon, and she might crash from the height. Too late, and she might be caught in the main ship's landing. An alert sounded through the ship. The aliens had discovered her in the bay. The door behind her opened, and Captain stood there with several other Vexerans. They rushed toward her craft just as it reached the edge of the open bay doors. Susan hit what she hoped was the propulsion control. The small craft shot forward and out of the bay, leaving the Vexerans behind. She was free of the ship, flying through Earth's sky in an alien craft that she barely knew how to control. Below, she could see familiar landscape. There was the town of Cedar Creek. And there, in the distance, was the old quarry. Susan could even make out vehicles parked at the edge. Frank and the others were waiting for her. Susan aimed the craft toward the quarry and began her descent, hoping she could land without crashing. Behind her, the massive Vexoran ship continued its own unplanned journey to Earth. Susan Miller fought with the controls of the small alien craft as it dropped through the sky. The machine responded differently than any aircraft she had ever flown. It seemed to almost read her thoughts, moving sometimes before she fully pressed a control. The quarry grew larger below her. Susan could see 4 vehicles parked at the edge. One was Frank's truck. Relief flooded through her at the sight. After nearly a week in space, she was almost home. Behind her, the massive Vexoran ship followed her down, its huge shape now visible to everyone for miles around. Susan knew the aliens would be desperate to recapture her and their small craft. They wouldn't want humans to get their hands on advanced technology. Susan pressed what she hoped was a landing control. The small craft slowed its descent but still came down faster than she wanted. She braced herself as the teardrop-shaped vessel hit the ground hard, bounced once and skidded across the quarry floor, throwing up dust and gravel. When the craft finally stopped moving, Susan took a deep breath and checked herself for injuries. A few bruises, but nothing serious. She looked for a way to open the bubble top. There was a panel with a hand-shaped impression. She placed her hand on it, and the bubble slid open with a soft hiss. Frank was already running toward her, with Gerald, Dr. Bryant, and Ben close behind. Susan climbed out of the craft just as Frank reached her. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. "You made it," Frank whispered, his voice shaking. "You really made it." Susan hugged him back, allowing herself a moment of relief before turning to look at the sky. "We're not done yet. The main ship is coming down too." Everyone looked up. The Vexoran ship was descending toward the quarry, its huge oval shape blocking. "Out the sun, they're following you," Gerald said, eyes wide with amazement and fear. Susan nodded. "They want their craft back, and they want me back too. I've caused them a lot of problems." "What do we do now?" Ben asked, staring at the approaching ship. Susan quickly explained the plan she had formed during her days on the ship. The Vexorans have 2 main weaknesses. Their eyes are very sensitive to bright flashing lights, and their hearing can be overloaded by certain sound frequencies. "Did you bring the equipment I asked for?" Dr. Bryant pointed to their vehicles. "Everything's ready. We have the lights set up on the trucks and the sound system is ready to go." "Good," Susan said. "They're not fighters, but they are still dangerous. They have weapons that can stun or paralyze. We need to disable them quickly." Frank squeezed Susan's hand. "Are you sure you're up for this? You just escaped from space." Susan gave him a tired smile. "I've been through worse training exercises. Let's finish this." They ran back to the vehicles as the Vexoran ship settled on the far side of the quarry. It was at least 3 times the size of a school bus, its silver surface reflecting the afternoon sun. Susan directed everyone to their positions. Frank and Ben would operate the lights. Dr. Bryant would control the sound system. Gerald would stay back, ready to drive Susan's escape craft away if needed. A door opened in the side of the Vexoran ship. Captain emerged, followed by 5 other aliens. They carried devices that Susan knew were weapons. The aliens moved carefully, their huge black eyes scanning the quarry. Susan stepped forward, standing in plain sight. "That's far enough," she called out. Captain stopped, focusing on Susan. "You have caused significant damage to our research vessel. Return our transport craft and surrender yourself." "Not going to happen," Susan replied. "You kidnapped me from my home. On Earth, that's a serious crime." "Your laws do not apply to us," Captain said. "We are an advanced species with the right to study lesser beings." Susan smiled. "If we're so much lesser, how did one of us cause so much trouble for you?" Captain made a sharp gesture, and the other Vexorans raised their weapons. "We will take you by force if necessary." "Now!" Susan shouted. Frank and Ben switched on the powerful lights they had set up on their trucks. The lights began flashing in the pattern Susan had described, rapid pulses that changed color from red to blue to green and back again. The Vexorans cried out, their hands going to their huge eyes. At the same time, Dr. Bryant activated the sound system. A high-pitched tone blasted across the quarry, hitting the exact frequency Susan had specified. The aliens dropped their weapons, covering where their ears would be if they were human. They fell to their knees, unable to function under the assault on their senses. Susan ran forward, Gerald close behind her with a roll of duct tape. Together, they quickly bound the Vexorans' hands and collected their weapons. When all 6 aliens were secured, Susan signaled to turn off the lights and sound. The Vexorans remained on the ground, still dazed from the sensory attack. Susan stood over Captain. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to take your ship and leave Earth. You're going to report to your leaders that humans are not suitable for study. We're too dangerous. You cannot make demands of us," Captain said, though with much less confidence than before. Susan held up one of the alien weapons. "I figured out how these work while I was on your ship, and I know how to use your communication system. I've already sent messages to several Earth governments with the coordinates of Vexoran space and details about your technology." This was a bluff, but the alien couldn't know that. Captain's large eyes blinked rapidly, and what Susan had learned was a sign of alarm. "If you don't leave peacefully," Susan continued, "Earth will know you're here. Your secret study is already compromised. The best thing for you is to go home and never return." Captain was silent for a long moment. Finally, it nodded. "We will depart. Release my crew." Susan had Gerald cut the tape binding the Vexorans, but she kept their weapons. The small craft stays here," she said. "Consider it payment for kidnapping me." The aliens backed slowly toward their ship. Before entering, Captain turned to Susan. "You are not like other specimens we have studied. How is this possible?" Susan smiled. "You made a mistake. You judged by appearance and missed what was important. Not all predators advertise themselves." After the Vexorans were aboard, their ship lifted slowly from the quarry floor. It hovered for a moment, then shot straight up into the sky, quickly becoming a small dot that vanished in the blue. Frank put his arm around Susan's shoulders. "Do you think they'll be back?" Susan leaned against him, finally allowing herself to feel the exhaustion of the past week. "Not if they're smart. They learned an important lesson today." Dr. Bryant looked at the small alien craft that remained in the quarry. "What do we do with that?" "I promised Gerald he could study it," Susan said, "as long as he's careful." Gerald's eyes lit up like a child at Christmas. "I'll be very careful." As they walked back to their vehicles, Ben asked, "Won't the government come looking for it when people report seeing alien ships?" Susan smiled. "Probably, but we have some time, and sometimes the government needs to learn that ordinary people can handle extraordinary situations." 1 week later, life in Cedar Creek had mostly returned to normal. Susan was back teaching self-defense classes. Frank was working at the factory. Gerald, Dr. Bryant, and Ben would come over for dinner regularly, and the 5 of them would talk about their adventure while studying the alien technology in Frank's garage. Susan never told her students where she had been during her unexpected vacation. But she did add a new lesson to her classes. Always be underestimated by your opponent. It's the greatest advantage you can have. And somewhere in deep space, the Vexoran Scientific Council received a new report. Earth humans, classified as extremely dangerous, approach with caution, especially the females.